welcome everyone. It's great to have so many of you here to hear about some of the work that we've been doing over the last 10 years. Actually a little bit longer, but 10 years sounded like a really nice number. Thanks so much to Chinny Lowe. We've had a great week already. I've been here since Sunday night, and we've visited a whole bunch of schools this week looking at their libraries of the future. And so it's been a really informative week, listening to school leaders and to students and to people working in their libraries about how those environments can become so much better for teaching and learning, and particularly encouraging all the students in Singapore to become better readers and to enjoy their reading so much more. So it's been a really great week. What Jenny's asked me to do is to talk about the sort of the history of the work that we've been doing from our research group, which introduced as the Learning Environments Applied Research Network, which has originated in about 2009. The origins of it really stem from our past deans of our faculties. So I say our faculties because although I work in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, we have a very, very close and ongoing relationship with our School of Education. And so this dialogue between people in design and people in education has been really the nexus that has led to all of the work that in some ways is quite original, but in other ways has been going on sort of informally for a very long time. So I'm going to talk about sort of some of the things that we've learned and some of the things that we're working on at the moment to give you a sense of what sort of research we're engaged in and some of the impact, I guess, of some of that research over time. But hopefully this will work. But as Ginny said, I don't have actually an architecture background. I don't actually have architecture training. For a while, I thought I was a bit of an anomaly in our faculty because I didn't actually come from the design disciplines. I come from education. For many years, I was a science and biology teacher in secondary schools. And then most recently, which is until 2007, so it's really not that recent, I was also a primary school teacher. And this was the last school that I taught at. You can see here on the screen at Caulfield Grammar School. A really rich experience and something that I've really called on, having taught from the youngest year levels to the oldest year levels in school, and now all of the undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD students in the university sector. So I really had a great opportunity to think about education across all of those age groups, and that background, as you said, that background and having had that experience working in schools. How do schools work? What is the discourse about teaching and learning? But what we're trying to bring is what's the relationship between all of those educational objectives and the environments in which people are teaching and learning. And so that's what we're trying to bring. A few photos of probably the thing that really led me personally to thinking really carefully about how's the space having an influence? What sort of relational what sort of relations do the practices of teaching and learning have with the environment? And as I said, I spent a few years as a primary school teacher. I wasn't actually a classroom teacher. I worked with all of the staff who were classroom teachers, developing integrated units across the curriculum. And in that process, we created this science and technology centre at the school. And that was a great experience. We had all sorts of conversations. We consulted quite widely across the school and with elsewhere. And although I think now looking back on it, it's a bit rudimentary and the colours are a bit garish, it was a great experience in thinking about how can we bring a science and technology curriculum to life through creating an environment to do those aspects of the curriculum in primary school. So having done that, someone then said, oh, look, you might be interested in this PhD scholarship in this Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. They're looking for someone from education to do a PhD about pedagogy in space. And I thought, well, I'm going to put my hand up for that. And so luckily I did. They gave me the scholarship. I did the PhD between 2008 and 2011, and I've never left. And we've been able to do this kind of work ever since. So I guess this is kind of embodying a lot of the things that we're doing. We're sitting around, we're talking to people in schools, we're talking to teachers, we're talking to students, and we're trying to work with them often in a research capacity to understand their vision for teaching and learning, their objectives, and how the environment could better support them meeting those objectives. So I do get involved, as Ginny said, in a lot of designing of new schools, and some of that's not necessarily research, that might be direct consulting, but all of it sort of feeds into this agenda of how can we better understand what space can offer and how we can manipulate the environment to better meet the needs of people in schools. So this is our group. I'm one of two directors. My co-director is Associate Professor Wesley Eames. He's in our School of Education, and you may have, if you may have stumbled across some of his work. He's been quite prolific over the last few years, particularly with a project called Innovative Learning Environments and Teacher Change. Because all of our work's not necessarily only about the spaces themselves, it's also about how we're utilising those environments and how we can work with staff in schools to take advantage of environments that maybe they're not necessarily as familiar with. So as I started saying earlier, Learn was generated in sort of that 2008-2009 period by our then deans. They're both retired now. Tom Cavan was our Dean of Architecture, Building and Planning, and Field Rickards was our Dean of Education. And they said, look, there's no one researching these things that we know of around the world. Victoria, the state where we are in Melbourne, is likely to be building a lot of schools. We had a really steep increase in school-aged students in our population. So let's get ahead of the game and let's start that conversation. Let's start that work. And so they created this research entity called the Learning Environments Applied Research Network, and we've been collaborating with other universities and industry groups ever since. This is our building, just to give you a sort of sense of where we are on our University of Melbourne Parkville campus, which is about 2 kilometres from the centre of our city. Lovely building designed by John Waddell and Nutter Architects from Boston, and it's quite dramatic when you're inside in the atrium. There's this sort of huge hanging studio that catches most people's attention, but also quite a dynamic building that responds to what's going on across our semester. And that lower photograph there just gives a little bit of a hint at the fact that our building transforms into a gallery twice a year at the end of our semesters, when all of our design students' work from all of our disciplines put their work up on display, and they have what we call the Melbourne School of Design Exhibition, or MSDX. And in that week, which actually is next week, it's an absolutely wonderful experience to come and see this incredible array of work that's been produced by our design students. So we've obviously been doing this for quite a long time. We've been doing it for more than 10 years. And in that time, we've been working with state governments across Australia. And of course, probably you don't know, but education is not run federally. It's federally funded to a degree, but our states individually run their schools. And so we work with various states on projects thinking about a whole range of issues to do with the environment and teaching and learning. We also have a really big Catholic education sector. So about a quarter of students in Australia go to Catholic schools. So there are thousands of Catholic schools. And particularly, we've been working with the Melbourne Archdiocese schools, of which they have about 450, pretty much in an ongoing way for 10 years, which has been a great ongoing collaboration. We do other consultancies. We also sometimes work with individual schools when we're invited to do so on particular issues that they may have. And so that sort of gives you a sense of who our collaborators, who our partners. We do think about them very much as partners in the work that we're doing, and that we're learning as much from them as they are from us. But also pushing out those outputs, those publications that share the learnings with everybody. One of the things that's really kept our group going in terms of funding and research capacity has been our success in our Australian Research Council, or ARC, linkage grants. And these are large-scale, prestigious grants that are really hard to win. And we've been incredibly fortunate to run 5 of these grants back-to-back since 2007. The first one was the one that I did my PhD in, Smart Green Schools. This was a project which originally was intended to be about sustainable design or ecological design of schools, but actually became a project around the relationships between pedagogy and space, because that suddenly there was a realization that how we were teaching and how the spaces were affording various teaching and learning opportunities was something which we really needed to pick up on and explore. The second one future-proofing schools was a project about modular or relocatable buildings. Now, I don't think you have a lot of these in the Singapore context, but a lot of our schools are single story. Primary schools are on 3.5 hectares, secondary schools are on 8.5 hectares. And we have, with demographic change, what our schools do in Australia is they bring relocatable buildings in when student populations grow, and they take them away again and move them somewhere else when the population drops down again. So we have a large number of relocatable buildings. We have thousands and thousands of them in our state, and New South Wales and Queensland. Other states have these as well. So it's really quite an important component of accommodating students and accommodating staff in our schools. So that was a project about how to do that better. The third one, evaluating 21st century learning environments, was a project about how would you know and how would you measure the pedagogical effectiveness of a space. So usually when people have done what you might call post-occupancy evaluation, it's all about the building quality. It's about the indoor environment quality, what's the thermal comfort like, what's the air quality, etc. But very rarely, until we started doing this work, had people thought about how effective is the space for the types of teaching and learning we'd like to have occur. So that was a really terrific exploration, and we've been exploring that ever since. The fourth one I've talked about a little bit already, this innovative learning environments and teacher change. So less about design, but more about how do you work with teachers to take advantage of those environments that conceptually or theoretically should offer them opportunities to do perhaps a wider variety of things, to employ a broader spectrum of pedagogies, if you like, and a really substantial project led by my colleague, Wes Eames. And the last one, which I've been leading over the last few years, building connections, schools as community hubs. This is about not so much about the teaching and learning in schools, but about all of the other things that happen in schools, particularly welcoming parents, carers, community members to utilise those assets that schools have that are generally not in use outside of school hours. So we have growing population, overall government funding is of course limited. So we've got these assets that are really lying vacant, in the evenings, school holiday periods, etc. So we've been exploring how they can be better utilised, but also how they might be augmented to provide things that, sort of services that students and families of the school may need. So we have schools, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, being designed to include health services, a whole lot of wellbeing services, as well as sport and recreation on a much larger scale. So that's been a really fascinating project. But these 5 projects have really, I guess, sort of represented the trajectory of our work. It's quite responsive to what's going on, but also has meant that we can do other smaller projects in between. Just to give you a sort of an idea of our sort of the ecosystem, if you like, of our Learn group and how that's sort of built up and the dynamic of how the work we do gets done. I'll just sort of take you through a sort of a diagrammatic explanation of how our group is operating these days. So at the core, I guess there's Wes, there's myself, there's a couple of other long-term researchers who've been working with us for a period of time, and we're sort of the core. We're the people applying for grants, collaborating with others, and so on to do that. And then there's the grants, and we've also got capacity for sort of central administration of our group across the 2 faculties. But our partnerships have been really important, and they go in sort of 2 directions. As I said, we're learning from them, they're learning from us. And over time, we've found that more and more people are interested in partnering with the group, which has been terrific, both from education, and a lot of architects are really interested in partnering with us, partly because they want to know what's going on in education, so that when they're working with their clients, they have the language, they have the ideas, they're familiar with what the conversations are going to be when they're designing new schools. We also have quite a number of PhD students. I think I'm currently supervising 8. I say I think because a number of them have graduated over the last few months, which has been great. But at any one time within the group, we've often got somewhere between about 15 and 20 PhD students, which gives you sort of an idea about how interested people are in this. We've had a number of people from obviously Australia, but from New Zealand, and we've had 2 PhD students graduate in the last year from New Zealand. We've got people from Chile. I've got 2 students from Saudi Arabia, We've got people from the United States, people from the UK. So it's been terrific to have that sort of sense of, we're sort of the locus for this kind of work. And also that they're starting to go back to their own countries and to seed more learning environments research as well. And particularly one of my PhD students from Saudi Arabia, who's already working with the Ministry of Education on design standards, which I'm extremely excited about, because they're building more schools than we are in Australia, because they've got a whole lot of schools that they need. So we also do consultancy. So state governments will come to us and say, can you do this piece of work? They might be commissioning us to help them write policy as well. And we've done quite a lot of that over the last few years, assisting with sort of policy documentation around how to design schools better, how to utilise those environments better. Self-initiated projects, often seed projects, where we think there's some research that needs to be happening down the track, and just try to bring those key ideas together. Most recently, the work that we've been seeding from my own perspective has been about diversity and inclusion and designing for students with disability. So we initiated a few seed projects a couple of years ago, and now that trajectory, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. Obviously, our work also feeds into our teaching. We've set up a number of courses over the years, one called Innovative Spaces and Pedagogy, which has been really popular, mostly with students in education. But it has been a cross-disciplinary subject as well. So we've had our students of architecture and our students of education in the same course for, I think, 12 years now, which has been absolutely wonderful. Basically providing with project-based experiences of designing environments together, and engaging in that sort of participatory design process, which has been really quite a wonderful course to be associated with. Now handed that course on to my colleague, Marian Mahat, who's running that, and it's great to see that in really safe hands. We do run a lot of events too, and I was just saying to Ginny that for the 10th year, or the 10th time, we're running our conference in November 17, 18, called Talking Spaces. So if you're in Melbourne in mid-November, please consider attending. 2-day conference with a lot of people from education, a lot of people from architecture, again, having these conversations about what research do we need to do into the future, but also what have we been learning over the last couple of years. And of course, publications. You can't be an academic without publishing. So on our website, which I did have the address up earlier, and maybe I'll put it up later, we have a searchable publication repository with well over 100 publications. So if you're interested in learning environments research, there's a great resource there, which covers a whole lot of ground. So methodologically, I think the way we approach the work we do is probably a little bit unique, because what we're trying to do is to be really transdisciplinary. We're trying to sort of break out of the silos of design and education, and try and have these things meet in the middle. And so our work is about applied research, but it's very much informed by theory. Obviously, as I said, education and design together, and how do we think about those things not as separate but as heavily integrated. So we use language and sort of research theory about socio-spatial environments and socio-spatial thinking, socio-material thinking, this rise of this idea about the new materiality, relational thinking, where it's not about breaking things down, but about how things relate to each other and what's the dynamic in that setting. And also we've got some students now working on embodied learning and embodied understanding. So thinking about what's that user experience. And so a lot of the work we do is kind of understand what people are experiencing in environments, so that we can feed that information back into how can we then subsequently design them to create a better user experience. So again, other sort of fields of work, human-centered design, which is part of architecture, but also crosses over into technology design and a whole lot of other fields as well. And we borrow heavily from fields of environmental psychology and human geography in order to do that. And so I guess theoretical concepts, which we tend to come back to, they're sort of our favourites, if you like. James Gibson's ideas about affordances, we return to that over and over, and Another of my PhD students, Fiona Young, who's quite a prominent architect in Sydney, completed her PhD last year, really doing a deep dive into theories of affordance and learning environments. Roger Barker's work about behaviour settings and about how both the social and the physical combine to create settings for people to influence people's behaviour, and also complexity. So we're not really that interested in causal relationships, to be honest. We're interested in what you might call non-causal, that relational thinking, as I was talking about before. So historically, in places like the United States through the 80s and the 90s, there was a lot of work looking at things like thermal comfort and its relation to students' test scores. We don't do work like that. We're very much more interested in that sort of more ecological or more holistic view of how environments are operating. It is true that we do a lot of our work in schools, but I thought I'd worth mentioning that we also do research in universities, occasionally including our own, and in hospitals, because hospitals are places where a lot of learning occurs as well. We've had a sort of an on again, off again relationship, depending on when projects are running, with our medical school and also some medical schools in Queensland. And we're probably engaging with the medical school again with our work about diversity and inclusion, and particularly around students with neurodisabilities or with neurodiverse conditions. And also museums. Some of the museum work we've done has been particularly fun, including at the Melbourne Museum, and really enlightening of some of the other work we've done. So we did a great project at Melbourne Museum about affective learning encounters and about how students were interacting with museum exhibits with the very wonderful Diane Mulcahy in the education school. So our repertoire does extend beyond schools, but really the central tenet of our work is focused on schools. All right, so I must admit I was a bit worried about how many slides I had for this talk. It wasn't that I had too few, I had way too many, because there's so much to talk about, having done 10 years of work in the field. So what I'm going to do is just sort of I've selected some of the pieces of work that we've done in order to sort of share with you perhaps some of the themes of the work, and I've sort of overlooked other things, and I hope that I don't end up talking for too long. So evaluation has been really a really important component of the work, probably for at least the last 10 years, and it's ongoing. How do we understand that sort of pedagogical effectiveness? How do we understand if learning environments are working or not working? How are they enabling, constraining? What are the factors that are actually having an influence on the experience of the occupants? So there's a sort of a photo or an image here of a journal article that I wrote with my now retired mentor, Ken Fisher, in about 2012. I think it was ultimately published. It was written a few years earlier than that. Thinking about, how well do learning environments in schools work for teaching and learning? As I said, that pedagogical effectiveness. How would you know if one school design was better than another? What variables should be considered? And how can evaluation evidence be used to improve school designs? So that paper, we sort of integrated our thinking about that. We did, it's a literature review paper, you can tell from the title. But that was sort of like the stepping off point for us, I guess, if you like, into what's really a new field. And probably not surprisingly, this is my most cited paper by a long way. It gets read often, it gets cited every couple of months at least. And I think we've sort of started this focus on thinking about buildings not as structures, but as places for activity within the education sector, which has been really good. A couple of years after that, we started working with our partners, what was called Catholic Education Melbourne. They've now changed their name. But they engaged us directly to do this quite significant 3-year study. The timing of this was really important because when the global financial crisis hit, one of our federal government responses was to give all of our school systems a lot of money to build school facilities to generate economic activity. And so pretty much every primary school, you can imagine how many that is, every primary school in the country was given funding to build something. And about 25% of the secondary schools as well. So having done this and built a whole range of different things with the Catholic sector, they wanted to know which of those types of facilities were working better than the others. And so that's what we were commissioned to try and find out. As you may know, Victoria, our home state of Victoria, is sort of internationally renowned for taking a few risks in terms of what types of schools or what kinds of spaces are designed in schools. So that idea of innovative learning environments is very much part of our sort of lexicon, and part of the ambition of architects is to do something a little bit more unusual or a bit more innovative. And so there was this opportunity that arose through that funding, where a wide variety of different types of school facilities have been created. And they wanted to know, well, which of these are working the best so that we can sort of utilise that understanding to then use our own funding into the future to build new schools. So we had 3 years. We engaged with 38 schools. Some of them we engaged with because they had different types of facilities. So there's a few additional learning environments there. We had some great input from teachers who engaged in focus groups with us, really in depth, and a whole lot of students did surveys for us as well, which was really very, very insightful. And theoretically, we sort of approached this from this idea of built pedagogy. So there's an academic in the United States, Torin Monahan, who coined this phrase. And basically, he says that the design of school spaces is intrinsically tied to educational philosophies. And so this is an interesting stepping off point because not all schools have the same philosophy. So the first thing we did is we said, well, what are your objectives? What's your vision for teaching and learning? What does good teaching and learning look like in your school? And our evaluations, therefore, in each school were actually slightly different because all of those answers to those questions were different. So it was really about alignments of their educational vision with the environments that they had. So where these things aligned well, we're really interested, and where they didn't align well, we're also really interested. As I said, we're very interested in this sort of relational thinking or sort of ecological thinking. And so we also borrowed some work from Neil Gislason in Canada, who'd used earlier work to create this framework to think about sort of 4 quadrants, if you like. The sort of the ecology, or in this case, the buildings and the technologies and all the material components themselves. Also how schools are organised, including down to the curriculum. The student value, what's their sort of motivation? What's that climate, that student climate or the social climate in the school? And also the culture of the staff. What are they bringing? What sort of beliefs are they bringing? Patterns of behaviour. What sort of pedagogical habits might they be bringing to that situation? And so with quite a sort of sophisticated evaluation strategy, we tried to understand the dynamics of all of these things and where they gelled, where there was good alignments and where there weren't such good alignments. And sort of thinking about that in relation to the buildings themselves. The other thing we brought to this project, which has been I think quite an important sort of influence on the way people across Australia think about school spaces now, is some earlier work from Professor Kim Dovey and my old mentor Ken Fisher, where they'd looked at award-winning school designs from around the world, and looking at them spatially had worked out that there were basically kind of 5 types in terms of degrees of openness. So from the type A's, which are really traditional kind of cellular classrooms, often off a double corridor. In Singapore, because you have cross ventilation, it's often outdoor circulation space. To sort of increasing openness with operability, you can see in red. So operable walls or big sliders that might allow connections between spaces. So as you go sort of B, C, D, E, up to E, where it's really, really open and there's no chance to sort of start to close down those spaces. So these are just sort of representations. They're not actual floor plans from any particular school, but just to give the idea. And the influence that I think it's had is that before we started sort of somewhat inadvertently pushing this idea out, people were talking about traditional spaces and innovative spaces as if it was a dichotomy of one or the other. But really, if you start looking at school plans and visiting schools, it's really a continuum. And so, what's an innovative school is still an open question in our minds. So I'm sure it is in yours as well. So anyway, this was really quite useful because what we did is we sampled schools based on these typologies. We sampled, pretty even numbers across that 38 of A's, B's, C's, D's and E's to sort of give us a spatial context for our evaluations. And these are just sort of in a sort of a, like a plan view, kind of cartoon style plan view. Some of the spaces is some of the A's, lots of cellular classrooms in various schools. Some of the B's, which do have like common areas in green. So the classrooms do have a relationship with another space just beyond. Some of the C's, where you start to bring in that operability, you can start to connect spaces or disconnect them when you feel you need to. Some of the D's, which you can start to see the D's started to get a little bit more sophisticated in having these augmented spaces too, small spaces for meetings and for consults and so on, but also the operability and that additional space in green from the classrooms. And some of the type E's, which were really open, but they did have little spaces that people could duck into for various things, including students with autism and so on, who often get overwhelmed in big dynamic spaces, so that they could be aside and sort of retreat and desensitize. So to cut a long story short, with hundreds and hundreds of pages of reporting, we distilled all of this into 9 key principles. And without going through all of it in great detail, what we found was that people's preferences and their desires for environments really sort of hung off these 9 things. They wanted both a dynamic social and physical environment. That is, they didn't want static spaces. They wanted spaces that they could manipulate, that they could change in response to what they wanted to be able to do. And in order to do that, the spaces had to offer that variety and choice. So it wasn't just the uniform environment, but it offered opportunities to do this sort of activities for that hour and for another set of activities in the next hour, or change across the day or the week. That they wanted to have spaces for independent work for students, for small groups, and for whole class activities. And so sometimes that's where that access to different spaces of different scales became really important to them. And equally that idea of multiple learning settings, so that you're not always at the same desk doing the same things, but you've got variety in the day. Obviously, instruction is still really important, so that they wanted to have that ability to provide didactic instruction, but also that interaction and the dialogue between the students, as well as the thing that's really been probably the hardest thing to achieve is that reflective retreat. So in the libraries, we've been seeing this over the last few days, that students will often, particularly studying for their exams this week, it seems, to be aside, to have really concentrated environments where they're not disturbed. That's a little bit harder to support when you're talking about general purpose learning areas. But libraries do play that role really well. Options to socially organised students in different ways. So collaborative teaching has been an ongoing project, I would call it, in Victoria and around Australia. Thinking about teachers working together not only in their planning but also at the interface with the students, and so creating environments where they can actually do that and work well together. We've found that teachers working in 2s or often 3s is probably the best model. Once you go beyond that, the dynamics get a bit tricky. Good acoustics, absolutely essential. So these are more on the built environment side. Good sight lines and that use of glazing. People 10 years ago in Victoria were really worried that if we added more glass to our schools that people would become distracted all the time. Actually, that doesn't happen. We've got a lot of evidence to suggest that doesn't happen. Once it becomes sort of ubiquitous, people just don't notice. But allowing teachers to keep visual sight of all their students when they might be in a space that's just over there or just over there is really, really useful. And the last point is this one about that, if you build it, teachers won't automatically use those spaces in the ways that you might expect. And so, allowing sort of pedagogical development over time and also supporting that, we also found to be really, really important as well. So working with the staff, and that's where we started thinking about innovative learning environments and teacher change project. So sort of a brief summary there. The the sort of short answer is which environments work best from our typologies. Significantly, those type D environments were the most liked. And in terms of those 4 quadrants, that's where that sort of dynamic or that ecology really came together most effectively, as perceived by the students and the teachers. So we didn't use test scores to measure that, but it was very much about their opinions and their perspectives on which type of environments were working well for them. So that idea of variety and choice, whereby you can close down and have a very traditional classroom if you'd like, but also you can open up and you can send the students off to do their project work, to practice their oral, to do all sorts of things that perhaps traditional classrooms are not as well suited for. So that was that, and there is a couple of images here of some of the schools that participated. This was a girls only Catholic secondary school. You can see there on one side there's a classroom and there's a teacher providing some instruction. But also in this school, as a type D environment, there's quite a substantial common area as well. So there's a stage which gets used for not only performances, but also, as you can see, as a space for reading and group gathering. And also student lockers embedded within that too. This big boardroom table for a whole bunch of other kinds of activities. Tiered seating that faces the stage, great space for reading. So it offers that sort of sense of variety and choice. And you can sort of see that the girls are really enjoying those spaces. These are the kind of quotes that students would, kinds of things that students would say through some of the focus groups. And this is a student from that school I've just shown you. I really enjoy this space. I like how you can spread out into different spaces, whether you're working individually with partners or in a group. There's always enough furniture and space in this building. So that sense of student agency, which I'm sure is a discourse here, really well supported by that environment, giving them that choice. I will say this is quite a high achieving girls' school, and so there's absolutely no behaviour problems at all. So I think that's one of the other things we learned from the project is, where there's a good sort of social climate, that these environments can work even better because the students will take responsibility. It's not to say that they don't work better in places where the students are a bit more challenging, but that does require an additional level of understanding or establishing that understanding in order to them to take advantage of them in productive ways. One of those schools probably is this one. This one didn't actually participate in that project, but has subsequently engaged with us in research. Galen College in Wangaratta, which is one of our regional cities outside of Melbourne. But again, this sense of variety and choice. So, a more traditional classroom environment as part of this secondary college, but also what they've done over the last few years with a good friend, Ken Woodman, who's an architect in that part of the state, is create these learning common areas that offer those different settings for different types of learning activities. Including, and this is actually in a different school again, in another regional city called Benalla, little sort of sand or little sort of sand pits, we might call them, or places for dialogue and student planning of projects. And I had to show you this one because if you ask students what their favourite thing of their new environments are, it's invariably, if you give them really big whiteboards, they'll say it's the whiteboard, because this is the sort of thing that happens all the time. So, the teachers are providing them with problems, whether it's maths or they're planning, some sort of sociology project or whatever it may be. Students absolutely love whiteboards. And, floor to ceiling whiteboards with a little bit of soft seating and the ability to get together is extremely popular. And from all that we can tell, most often extremely productive in terms of their learning. So we haven't been measuring the learning outcomes, but from looking at their behaviour and their engagement, their observable engagement levels, they're pretty high. So there is a document which I know Chinny's got and is downloadable from our website, which sort of explains that evaluation project, how we did it. You might be interested in, because I haven't really talked about that, but also the findings, and it is quite detailed. But there's a resource there if you're interested. So I might pivot here and talk about something that's perhaps a more recent initiative of the group. And that's work thinking about designing for disability and inclusion. I'm really not quite familiar with the discourse here in Singapore, but certainly back at home and people we collaborate with in the United States and Canada and the UK and continental Europe as well. You know, the push for universal education, for integrating students with disability into schools is really, really strong. And so that started us thinking about, well, you know, how well are our environments in our schools actually supporting that integration? In Victoria, unlike the other states, we have a very much higher proportion of students with disability going to special schools. And so one of our state's objectives is to actually turn that around and bring more of those students who maybe aren't quite severely as disabled as others back into the mainstream school system. And so there's a lot of funding associated with that, but also there's a real dearth of knowledge. And what we've realised through our literature review work is that hardly anyone's ever researched this, which really comes as a huge sort of surprise initially to us. So there's a lot of work to do, and we think we've sort of started a program of research that we think will be many, many different projects over the next 10 years at least in order to generate that understanding. So we've articulated some of our thinking in a conversation article. I don't know if you know this publication. It's like a news outlet for academics. I read it every day. It's really fantastic. It's not just from Australia, but from places around the world. I don't know if there's a conversation that's in Singapore. No, possibly not. But there is a conversation in Singapore.
No, not in Singapore.
No.
We do read it.
Yeah. So they have been sort of creating new offices around the world to provide more academics with the opportunity to publish in this way. So we brought that together, and some of our thinking is sort of seated with that. And our argument in that article, if those of you perhaps are familiar with sort of disability and education conversations, is that this idea about universal design, which perhaps you know or perhaps you don't know, but for us, when architects are asked to design new facilities, they're often said, well, you need to follow the universal design principles. And if you're not familiar with them, these are the 7 principles, which are quite high level. They're really, really useful for bringing people's attention to what matters. You know, things like equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information. You know, it's like, is there a step there or isn't there if you can't see too well? Tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach and use. And so it really puts designing for disability on the agenda, which has been absolutely tremendous. But it also doesn't have enough specific information. This is my opinion, our group's opinion, for architects to really respond in an informed way. There's a huge spectrum of disability that we're talking about. So it's not designing for one particular student group. There's a wide spectrum of disabilities that need to be considered. And how do you create environments that actually are going to be conducive to teaching and learning and the integration of students into schools in that way? So we think there's a lot of work to do. It's not only us who think that the universal design principles are wonderful but limited. There's a particular sort of node of researchers up in Northern Europe who also have been thinking this for at least 10 years. So this quote here from Zwipsen. Universal design acts as a moral guide, an acknowledgement and a practical aspiration, but each project presents the need for specific data. So the project for us is school design. So school design needs specific data. And so our ambition and the work that we're doing already is to try and collect that information so we can inform people in architecture to design better schools, but filter that obviously through people in education about what it is that they're actually wanting to do in order to integrate those students better and make their experience of school so much better for them and for everyone around them. So we're doing 2 projects currently. One, again, with our great partners in the Catholic education sector, and another, which is supported. We have a disability institute at our university. And so they've been very supportive of this work as well, because they see that working on schools is a great way to work on society. So if we're integrating kids into schools better, we're probably starting to tick that box of integrating people with disability into society better as well. So we've been working on those 2 projects over the last year, and they'll continue for some time to come. Without going into the detail of actually what we're doing, I thought I'd just talk about sort of the big ideas. We're also very fortunate to have a professor in our School of Pediatrics, Christine Imms, who is the wife of Wiz Imms, which is really useful. So they can have a conversation over breakfast about kids with disability and school design and education really easily. But Christine's really an expert on this concept of participation. And this is one of her books that we were also fortunate to write a chapter in a couple of years ago. But thinking about, well, I'll go to this slide here. We're sort of thinking about this concept of participation in sort of meaningful involvement, if you like, of students with disability in schools as a sort of the objective. If we're thinking about diversity, perhaps that's an appreciation of that, you know, all students aren't the same and that there's a great variety and some of them need additional support. Then we might move on to thinking sort of aspirationally about how can we be more inclusive? And ultimately getting to this idea of how can we ensure that everyone can have meaningful participation and involvement in their school and trying to understand their lived experience, which comes back to our user experience perspective. So that's kind of the high level concept that we're working from, is to get to deep understandings about, you know, what are the levels of appreciation? What are the levels of aspiration in our schools? And where there is that aspiration, how can we work with them to create sort of exemplars that others can follow and aspire to in terms of creating great lived experience? So really simply, we're trying to, we want to know how to build schools to make it easier for students with disabilities to participate in school. So that's as simply as we could put it. And that's what we've been telling everyone, is we want to know how we can make schools designed better for people with disability to participate. So we know that we're not anywhere near this just yet. There's a lot of work. We think it's a very, very complicated sort of field, but that's where we're trying to go with it over the next few years. One of the interesting things, we've looked at all the, you know, education for all and the Salamanca Statement, which is, you know, UNESCO's great work that's been informative for years and years about integrating students in schools. But interestingly, we've been talking to the state governments around Australia as well. And I just use this, and I don't think they mind me saying this because we've talked about it publicly before, but in Queensland, they're really well advanced with thinking about students with disability in schools. And they've got this wonderful, quite elaborate framework about how, you know, every student can succeed. But if you have a look through all of that, nowhere does it include a mention of space. So we sort of pointed that out to them and they said, oh yes, we really should be thinking about that. And that's true probably for other states. And I think a lot of people, because, you know, a lot of this comes from people in special ed and so on. And my feeling is it's not that they don't think about it, but they're just perhaps not empowered to take it on. And so part of our work is sort of working with these people and sort of bridging those gaps so that they feel like they can take on, you know, school architecture as part of, you know, their approach to, you know, thinking about how every student can succeed. So we're pretty hopeful that they'll be partnering on some research with us pretty soon. I think it's highly likely. Just to give you a sort of sense of where some of the school designs in this field have gone, this is a school that was designed in 2016 and I was involved. Armstrong Creek School is quite, receives a lot of notoriety around the country. It was sort of somewhat experimental in that it's a school where 30% of the students have diagnosed disabilities, or approximately 30%. So it was designed with that in mind, and 70%, you know, sort of mainstream students. And so it needed to sort of respond to this larger than normal cohort of kids with a whole range of challenges. And so as in quite a few of these schools, it's one of those sort of type D environments. There's a lot of interconnection. There's some areas that are closed off, but it's meant to be quite responsive to need. And so it's one of those, we haven't actually done an evaluation of this school, but I'm desperate to do it to find out how well it actually works. But it does have spaces that you wouldn't normally find in a mainstream school. So this is one of the sensory rooms. There's a large number of students with autism, and you know they need to retreat at times. You can see these students just sort of getting out of that somewhat chaotic milieu of the rest of the school. And also the outdoor spaces as well are very much more about access. All the levels are all really appropriate, so that those kids with limited mobility can access things. But also it's thinking about the kinds of activities, and this photo probably doesn't do it quite justice, but thinking about how students with disability can occupy themselves and be integrated into the life of the school outside in the yard as well. And we've also been looking at specialist schools. So these are dedicated schools for kids with intellectual disabilities. And things like some of these new schools are thinking very much more about the transitions between classrooms and other spaces as well, and activating those environments for activity. Some students not only need to sort of retreat from stimulation, they also need to be stimulated. And so, using those spaces that would normally just be a corridor to enable those sorts of things to happen in schools has been really interesting to watch over the last few years. We've also been speaking with Associate Professor Joss Boys in the UK, who's been doing work on, she's probably the only other real person we've found who's been doing work on this over a sustained period. And so she's put us onto some of the other schools in the UK, including the Willows, which is not unlike Armstrong Creek. It's a mainstream school, but with a higher than normal proportion of students with disability. And she's worked with that school. She worked on the design of that school as well. She's also in a school of architecture, but very, very much thinking about schools and education. So again, I'll just check how we're going for time. Yep. One of the other sort of bigger commissions that we've had, perhaps the most important one we've ever had, was some work that the Victorian State Government asked us to do to reformulate the school area schedules. So some of you may be familiar that the sort of schools are only allocated certain spaces and certain floor areas for those spaces, and it had been about 25 years since they'd been updated in our state, and the state knew that they were going to be designing a lot of new schools. In fact, they have a 100 new schools program, which I think Jenny may have mentioned at the beginning of the day. And so ahead of that program, they wanted to update the area schedules for schools. And so we were fortunate to be engaged to do that work and to create a new area schedule for new schools in the state. And that was, quite a significant and slightly intimidating task because we knew it really mattered. But we approached it fundamentally from this perspective. We were thinking about, what types of learning spaces can support the educational programs and practices of the 21st century. So the conversation about the old schedules, the old school areas, was they're outdated. They're probably not responding to new curriculum. The four things in blue here: the curriculum, the types of pedagogies that people are wanting to employ, thinking about community as well and who else might be using those facilities, and also well-being, because it's certainly been heightened since with the pandemic. But thinking about students' well-being and teachers' well-being was also really important, thinking about what types of spaces the schools actually need. And interestingly, I'd been showing a slide that had these words on it for a while, and when it became a reality, it was kind of quite amazing. So, this question about if you were designing 100 new schools, what types of learning spaces would you build, suddenly became a real project. It wasn't a hypothetical, it was real. And it's been going on. And last week, they sent out a press release saying that they'd delivered 74 of those 100 schools in the last 4 years. So it's been a really huge escalation of the school building program. Before we started doing that work, this is sort of give you a bit of context, and I have made this black and white for effect. This was the kind of schools that we were designing in sort of 2008, 2009. The idea that you could have a slightly wider learning street that wasn't just a corridor, but maybe support a little bit of other activity was there, and that you might have larger aperture doors that might allow people to bleed out from their classrooms. But really, that was the extent of the innovation in 2008, 2009. This was a school that won the Best New School Design Award that year. So let's fast forward, a little over a decade. We've come a long way. Yes, is the answer. So this is one of our newer schools, only constructed a couple of years ago, actually, as a replacement for an existing school. You know, and suddenly this idea of having a whole variety of different environments for different purposes has really caught on in our state and around Australia. So I can almost guarantee if you work into any of these new schools, they'll have one of these big tiered seating areas, which gets used for, you know, gatherings. But also, if you'll notice, there's these little nooks that appear all over our schools these days, so that people can just that reflective retreat. They're quite informal spaces often. Now this is in the library of this school, and there's not that many books there yet. Ginny, sorry about that. Should have gone back and taken another one more recently. But this idea that this sort of variety and choice that I was talking about earlier has really taken off. And there are a lot of classrooms in this school. I just don't have photographs of them because they're not that interesting to me. But this idea that, you know, that the school and the sociology of that social setting really need to be in harmony with each other. And so, you know, the transit also becomes a place to dwell, to meet with your friends, to do some learning. The common areas that are beyond the classrooms are also really quite rich and provide a whole range of settings, not unlike, to be honest, you know, airport lounges often, you know, that gets referred to a lot by the architects. You know, and other settings for sort of group gatherings. So where those common areas are, you know, obviously the students are dissipating to do their group work or their individual work, but also being able to bring them together, you know, for organisational instruction, you know, so that the teacher does have a degree of control and they're not just communicating with them through technology, which obviously happens a lot these days, particularly after the pandemic. But this variety of what we call pedagogical encounters is provided. And so we're sort of designing schools based on this diagram that we created. And you probably can't read it really, or maybe you can, but this sense that maybe not all schools need all of these spaces, but for general purpose areas, these are the sorts of things that we think are important to consider. So things like, you know, collaborative or general learning areas, direct instruction still being really important, presentation spaces, quiet reflection and reading, small meeting areas, you know, places for resources, obviously really important. And the complaint that keeps coming back is we don't have enough storage. That's always the first thing people in schools say. You know, teacher resources, student storage or lockers. And then other things that you might consider too, like maker spaces or wet areas that might support ongoing project work. So they're not the science or the technology or the art, but they're smaller spaces where students can conduct or carry on with those projects, display, you know, and then starting to some of these consult rooms, quiet spaces. This is where the disability thing starts to come in. So this is now in the policy documents for the state, and is, you know, it's asked that people consider all of these types of spaces, whether or not they actually deliver them. You know, that's a choice for the design team and for the school. But certainly that idea that you know, just delivering classrooms isn't really meeting the needs in terms of the types of experiences for teaching and learning that people are wishing to pursue. So this is sort of some pictures about how some of them might be translated into design. You know, from the collaborative areas where it's sort of, you know, students and you know, collaborative tables to presentation spaces to little aside spaces that students might find comfortable both socially and physically. You know, quiet retreats, you know, that could be quite studious spaces looking out the window, or a little inset that provides a little sense of coziness and a sort of sense of you know, being aside, to sort of indoor-outdoor maker spaces as well. So all of these things are continuously appearing in our schools. They had already, I should say that. It's not like we initiated it, but we consolidated it, I think, in terms of these are the objectives. And some others as well. And I really like this set of lockers, which has a periodic table in one of our science schools. And the students obviously very good because they pointed out that the decals were incorrect once you got up to, you know, a number about 100 and something. So they had to change them because they got the periodic table wrong. So great students, and that's the document there that provides the details, about 120 pages, I think, for architects designing new schools to try and understand how to articulate that through their designs and how to work with schools in order to do that. I'm getting a bit shorter on time now, so I'll probably just talk about this project, which is that fifth of the ARC linkage projects, building connections, schools, community hubs. We had this terrific bunch of partners, including 2 state governments in Victoria and South Australia, the Catholic system in Parramatta, which is in Sydney, Brand Architects, Clark Hopkins Architects, and also RMIT University as well. And one of the great things about having all those partners, but they were the most informed people when it came to thinking about how schools can be operated as more than a school already when we started the project. So now we've all collectively taken that to a more informed position. We also wrote this article in the Royal Society of the Arts journal in the UK not too long ago. And I sort of included it because I think a lot of what our research has boiled down to is this sort of line across the bottom here. When we started this project, it was pre-pandemic, and it was a really difficult project to do because we did it from our homes. As some of you know, we had the longest lockdowns in the world, and so we were at home for periods of up to 4 months at a time. But what that did in Melbourne was helped us think, or helped everyone realise how important schools are as places for socialising, and the sort of the integral nature of schools in the way our societies function. So when you remove that from everyone desperately missed it. Not just the students who missed it a lot, but the parents, particularly of the primary school students, and that includes me. And so this idea that, we need to rethink schools as critical neighbourhood infrastructure, and I think there's this mentality that schools are places for teaching and learning and perhaps not necessarily much else. But actually they do a whole lot of other things that perhaps we didn't realise until the pandemic. They're sites of, social connection. When you think about, who you socialise with, certainly people in Australia, a lot of people's friends are other parents of their primary school students in particular. But more than that too, schools can deliver all sorts of health and wellbeing services. They're great sites for sport and recreation because they have sport and recreation facilities, but they're not necessarily activated, or the facility management doesn't support that kind of activity. And so our argument based on research is that we can do this so much better and get a whole lot more out of those very expensive assets called schools to benefit a whole lot more people. We do have some extraordinary examples of where this happens, however. There's always the exceptions, aren't there? This is probably the most extraordinary in the country, I would argue. This is again, in a regional centre called Bendigo. It's one of our bigger regional cities outside of Melbourne. It's the Lumbrara Theatre. Now, this used to be a prison in the 1800s, and it was used until, surprisingly, not that long ago, about 20 years ago, and had been vacant for quite a long time, but it's directly adjacent to the senior secondary college in Bendigo. And our Department of Justice sold it to the Department of Education for $1 and said, you can have it. You can deal with all the asbestos, which cost them about some millions of dollars to remove. And you can reimagine this site as part of your school, which was an amazing opportunity because, now with a lot of investment from a lot of state government, federal government, a lot of philanthropic money, they now have this incredible 1,000 seat theatre and a whole lot of other performing arts and recreation and visual art spaces. It gets used for weddings, it gets used for all sorts of things. So this is not your typical school environment, but these are the kinds of things that are starting to happen where people realise that schools as custodians of public spaces can really work. And in this case, this is probably the best example that we've got. So that's the exception. Probably more the norm in terms of augmenting schools with additional facilities is in the early years, preschool, which can often include long day care and kindergarten for students, but more and more it's providing access for parents and other adults to services as well, particularly though, referring them off to whatever sort of care that they might need, but also providing play groups and transition to school programs as well. So we're seeing buildings like this one, and programming to bring people in, to make them feel welcome, particularly in our outer suburbs. So we've got a huge sort of sprawling growth. It's far lower density than you have here, with 1- and 2-story housing, and a lot of young families moving to those outer suburban areas where there's not necessarily a lot of social connection. So bringing people together, providing opportunities for them to get to know their neighbours, get to know the people in their neighbourhood, really, really important. And so we're seeing this a lot, this idea of creating spaces not just for school students, but also for their parents and their siblings who may be younger than them. And this is really taking off all around the country. This is another example of one of those facilities. This one was built to plug in literally to the school campus. So I wonder if this will work. So this is the child and family centre, and you can see some outdoor play spaces, which are pretty wonderful. And this was an existing school. So they moved the school administration to here, and you can walk, as the next image shows, I think, straight through. And so there's this direct connection between the family and early years services and the school, and people feel like, you know, they're sort of joining the school when their kids are born, and it's been incredibly successful. So this is a program which a group called Our Place is organising, and they originally created one of these about 10 years ago, learned all the things that they should do, all the things they shouldn't do, and now they've done 10 more, and they're going to continue to scale that up quite substantially over the next few years. Again, supporting people in community as well as kids' education. They're some of the partners in that project. I'm going to skip a couple of slides. Might touch on this one, so I've only got 5 minutes left. Just also under that umbrella of schools as community hubs, the other thing that's been happening, which I think is worth sort of noting around Australia, is thinking about communities not as being homogenous, but composed of different populations. And I think you do that quite well here. But this project in North Melbourne, which is very central Melbourne, this is a 6-story primary school with a kindergarten on the roof, has been particularly interesting. It's currently almost finished construction. It'll be operating next year. But the thing that I wanted to draw your attention to was that really notably over the last 3 years, our affinity for Indigenous representation in our schools has taken off. This is something people talked about, that they do quite well in New Zealand. But this school, I think, is probably going to be a tipping point for thinking about how can we bring Indigenous culture, Indigenous design, Indigenous language into our new schools. And so there's this whole story about the emu's egg and the emu's born, and all of these things happen, and then Bunjil the eagle, which is sort of the famous representation of Indigenous storytelling, sort of is represented by the students who are the younger kids up in the kindergarten on the roof. Interestingly, our state named 6 new schools which are opening next year, and all of them have Indigenous names. So it's been a really interesting shift in a very, very short space of time to sort of think about acknowledging and representing our First Nations people and embodying that in the design of the schools, in the names of the schools, in the language, which we all still struggle with the pronunciations, but you know, everyone will be working on this, and I'm sure for the young kids coming in, it'll be absolutely second nature by the time they've left. So really quite fascinating. Look, there's some really interesting photos. We've also been looking overseas at, you know, what sort of schools community hub activity is going on. This is one in Ikast in Denmark, which we found particularly fascinating. It is a school, but its outside hours use is absolutely extraordinary. So that's some of the outside hours use, the local choir doing a performance, adult dance classes after hours, singing as well, performances. This is, you know, and the students do all these things too, of course, but one of the interesting things in Denmark is that their local municipalities are responsible for providing both education and social services. So the integration of those things into their facilities is very much more common than it is certainly for us. And so you can see it's still a school. So looking overseas where some of the governing structures are different and what that can lead to is really been quite fascinating to us. I really do need to start winding up here. Maybe I'll do that by just sharing a few images of the Building Connections project. We had an exhibition recently, It was great because we've had so few opportunities to actually have people in person like today. And we had a really great turnout for our exhibition, which is called Sharing Schools, Building Communities. And what we did is try to communicate some of the key findings of that project about how can we create more than a school. We've created an ebook of the exhibition too, which you can if you type Sharing Schools, Building Communities, should come up on Google, to sort of depict what is happening around our country in terms of designing schools for community as well as for students. And so these are some of the sort of exemplars, if you like, that are depicted in that ebook and were represented in the exhibition. This one, very much more of a sporting context. The previous one, very much more of a sort of a cultural context. And one thing we've realised is that you can't sort of stamp out the same thing over and over. It's very contextually specific as to what communities need. And this one's very much more about early years and supporting growing communities in outer suburban areas. So all of these schools and communities are different, is one of the things that we've very much come to understand. And so designing for difference, designing for that has become really important. Getting a sign that says my time's up. So I'll just go to here. The new book, published through Springer, should come out in the next, well, certainly before the end of the year. We've just sent the manuscript back to them with a few changes. So that sort of embodies a lot of the findings of that project. We're also creating what we're calling this How to Hub Australia framework, which will be advice for policymakers, school leaders and designers about how to approach this. And it already includes things like this journey map, which is kind of a generic pathway that we feel people can follow. And also this, we're calling it like an integrative briefing model. We're not shying away from the fact that doing this is actually really complicated. It requires integrating all of these different factors and getting some alignments between them. So our book helps people unpack that, and the How to Hub Australia will provide further advice around if you're interested in your school becoming more than a school and providing community support. These are the things to consider, and these are the things that you really need to take on in that project. So maybe I'll finish there. It's been a bit of a whirlwind tour of a whole bunch of things, but hopefully that sort of gives you a sense of what our group's been doing over the years, and really happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ben.